We want to know the truth about ourselves, and we very much don't want to know the truth about ourselves. I mean, we may fool ourselves sometimes into thinking we want to know the truth about ourselves, when most of the time what we really want is a verification of our self-feelings and how we see ourselves. And it's hard to reconcile those two things. It just is. We both seek and resist awareness about the reality of who we are. We all have weak spots and we all have blind spots that we cannot navigate on our own. And we think we can see them, but usually we can't because we're human. So we need someone to remind us of our deepest aspirations and values and to warn us when we may be getting off track. We need someone occasionally to perform spiritual surgery on us when our hearts get hard or our vision gets dim. In other words, we need somebody who will tell us the truth in life and not just what we want to hear. We do. We need truth tellers because our capacity to live in denial about ourselves is astounding. There's a whole field of social psychology that is developed called cognitive dissonance that describes the reality of our inability to always see our imperfections and to live in a way that is consistent with our own self-concept. We're all, in some way or another, like the man on a diet who drove past the bakery and said he would only stop for donuts if there was a place right in front of the bakery. And there was, on his 6th time around. Many of us have never invited somebody else to be a truth teller in our life. We're afraid of what we might find out. Many of us don't want any constructive criticism at all. What if the truth about me is too painful for me to hear? What if it's something I just don't want to know? When I think about longing for truth and fear of the truth at the same time, which I think nearly all of us have, there are two truth statements that immediately jump into my mind. One is from one of my probably 10 favorite movies of all time, A Few Good Men, with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. And at the climactic scene, it goes something like this.
I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
I think to a large degree, that's true of many of us. We can't handle the truth. And yet, it was our Lord Jesus who said in John 8, verse 32, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Now, you can't have it both ways. You either believe Jack Nicholson or you believe Jesus. You either have to believe that the truth will set you free or you can't handle the truth. And that's this foundational paradox that is at play in nearly all of us. We desperately need somebody to tell us the truth in our life, but we really don't want to hear it. We really don't. That makes it essential that we make decisions about what kind of values we want to honor, what kind of spiritual practices we want to engage in, what kind of friends and neighbors and sons and daughters and husbands and wives we will be. But decisions are not enough. You can make a decision about all those things, but you must have accountability. You must have accountability for them. We all need somebody who will ask us, how's it going? How is your life working out? How are those decisions working out for you? Many years ago, I mean way back before I even moved here, I formed what you might call a Christian council, and I told 3 people in my life, mentors and friends, I told 3 people in my life, and they're all still there and they're all still doing it. You tell me if you see something that is a hindrance to me or to my ministry. You tell me. Don't you try to spare my feelings. And I did that because of some wise advice I got one time. Ira North was the preacher at the Madison Church of Christ, which in the 60s and 70s was the largest Church of Christ in the world. And I was working with him in a television project, and I'll never forget, he looked across his desk at me one day and he said, Randy, we were talking about television ministry. He said it in that context, but he said, Randy, listen to me. Listen to your critics. Your critics will tell you things your friends won't tell you, because your friends are trying to spare your feelings. So listen to your critics. You may not always agree with them. You may not even like them, but listen to them, because they will tell you things your friends may not tell you, trying to spare your feelings. And organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous and Weight Watchers fully understand that truth. They operate totally on the principle that no matter how many times you say, I'm not going to eat that or I'm not going to drink that, you most certainly will, unless you have somebody holding you accountable. Unless you have an accountability partner, unless you have somebody who will be a truth teller in your life. So I want to look at the story of one of the most famous men in the Old Testament. He made some horrible choices and had a deep failure in his life. But thankfully he had a truth teller that many of us don't have or won't allow, that turned his life around. David wrote over half the Psalms. I've only known one 5-talent man in my entire life. One 5-talent man in my entire life. But David was a true 5-talent man. He could do anything. Play the harp, sing, write psalms, champion warrior, king, the only man the Bible ever described as a man after God's own heart. He was a 5-talent guy, and God doesn't make many of those. But 2 Samuel 11 and verse 1 says that it was the time when kings went to war, and he didn't go this time. He stayed behind. He thinks to himself, I'm in middle age now. I don't want to go. I don't have to go. So I'm not going to do it. Let them go without me. There's something unusual going on with David here. That had never happened before. He had always gone to war with his men. So there's something unusual going on here. He's not an old man yet, but he's also still not a young man. And the women aren't looking at him quite like maybe they used to. So he's reaching sort of that, what we call, middle-age crisis. He's not the golden boy anymore, but he's not a senior citizen either. Well, he's not sure what he wants. He just knows there's a restlessness. He knows there's a reason he's going to not go with his men out to battle. As far as we can tell, David being king and all, and accountable or responsible to no one, doesn't share those feelings with anybody else. Then one day he sees a woman out bathing on a roof. Now there are some people who have said, what was Bathsheba doing bathing outside? Well, that's ignorance. The Bible never one time places any blame on Bathsheba. First of all the men were gone off to war. Secondly, in the spring, at that time of the year, is when the rains came, fell into, they didn't have the plumbing that we have today, came in and filled the basins where they could shower. And so she's on the top of a roof taking a shower. There are supposed to be no men there. They're off at war. David, who had not done what he was supposed to do and what he usually did, is there. He sees her. He sends someone to find out about her. He's already married. He's king. He's God's representative to the people. And when he gets the answer about who it is, he's told, David, isn't this Bathsheba? This is somebody's wife, Uriah the Hittite. David apparently doesn't care if he's in the right place with God. If he was a man after God's own heart at that moment, that would have stopped him in his tracks, which is undoubtedly why his advisor told him that. This is somebody's daughter, somebody you know. This is somebody's husband, one of your soldiers. But it didn't. He's not interested in hearing the truth right now. He's not interested in accountability right now. There's a foundational paradox about almost all of us. We want the truth about us, but we don't really want the truth about us. And that's David. Have you ever, be honest now, and I want to see the hands of the people who've done this. Have you ever driven toward a red light and you're going slightly over the speed limit and the yellow light comes on and you hit the accelerator? How many of you have ever done that? Raise your hand. How many of you have never done that? Raise your hand. We need to know who the non-truth tellers are among our family of God. You do understand. Let's see if we can just do this like elementary school style. What does red mean on the red light? What does green mean on the red light? And what does yellow mean on the red light? Speed up. This crowd's too honest. That's what I got. I got some truth tellers in here is what I got. The yellow means caution. David has been given a caution light here. This is Bathsheba, the daughter of one of your most trusted leaders, Eliab, and the wife of Uriah. And he just hits the accelerator. He runs right through the caution. You know the story. He brings her up to the palace. He sleeps with her. He sends her back home. And then comes the message. David, the woman is conceived, and she is pregnant. Uh-oh. Didn't plan for that little side effect. So David goes into action. Instead of having a truth teller come and say to him and allowing for somebody or asking somebody to come and tell him the truth, he sets up a whole other plot. He sends for her husband Uriah the Hittite to come home from war, and he brings him to the palace of all things, and he salutes him, and he then tells him, go home and spend some time with your wife. You know what Uriah does? If ever there was an honest, legitimate teammate of courage, if there was ever an award-winning Marine, it was Uriah. He went home and slept outside on the steps because he said, if my fellow soldiers can't come home with their family, neither will I. Uh-oh. David had not planned for that. What do I do now? Well, here's what he does next. He contacts his chief general, Joab, and he says, I want you to send Uriah out into the front lines of battle. And I want you to withdraw all the other soldiers so that Uriah is killed. And he does. And he is. And David thinks he has navigated through the whole affair successfully. He has figured a way not only to do it, but to cover it up. He thought the great danger was that someone might find out. Listen to me. That is not the great danger. The great danger is that no one will find out. Did you hear me? What we think when we cover up the truth, when we cover up the sin, and think we have gotten away with it, is, whew. That's the danger. That's the danger. That's eternal danger. How long does David live that way? We don't know. How long does he continue to go into worship and lead the people into worship and be the king, pretending to worship, pretending to lead the people, while inside he carries this load of unconfessed, unrepentant sin and guilt? We don't know for sure. We know it was at least 9 months. Every day he gets a little further and further away from his sin and his cover-up, and every day God gets a little further and further away from David. And anytime we try to handle temptation in isolation, we're extremely vulnerable to deception. Author Gary Richmond, in one of his books, told a phenomenal story about this. He said when he was a young man, he worked in a zoo that had a 13-foot-long king cobra. Its venom glands contained enough poison to kill 1,000 adults. The cobra had a scar that made him look like the embodiment of evil, but worse, it meant that when the snake shed his skin, the eye cap didn't come off. So it had to be removed by hand. And unfortunately, cobras don't have hands. So that meant that 5 people had to go in every time the cobra needed treating. Gary was one of them, an assistant who carried the instruments, the scalpel and the sponge. There were also 2 keepers, a zoo curator, and the vet, who had the big job. They entered the room, and he said the cobra stood at full stature, deciding which one of the 5 was his first meal. And he said they did what you have to do when you're capturing a snake of that kind, with lightning speed. They threw the net behind the snake, grasped behind its venom glands, and the vet said, let's get this over with as quick as we can. Gary said even the vet's hands were trembling. Drops of sweat were falling off everybody's head except the cobra. And the vet asked him if he had any cuts on his hands, and Gary said no, and he said, well, then take this piece of cotton and stick it in his mouth. Gary said, you do it. And he said, no, you have to do it. That's your job. And so he picks up this piece out and sticks it in his mouth so that the snake will bite down on it and start releasing all of its venom. And as the team worked, the curator explained that every year several full-grown elephants die from one king cobra bite. A man could never survive. Not even think about it. And that's why he was having Gary drain the venom sacs. The curator's hands were sweating and his fingers were starting to cramp, but he certainly wasn't going to let go at all. And then he explained why it might be called the secret of the snake. And I learned this while reading his story. More people are bit trying to let go of a snake than they are trying to catch a snake. They're easy to grab, but they're hard to let go. And he said that's true of everything that can destroy human character. Deceit, bitterness, lust, in the case of David, greed, in the case of David, unforgiveness, easy to grasp, hard to let go. It's a fatal tendency of men and women to think we can handle the snake on our own. But it's been going on since Genesis chapter 3 and the Garden of Eden and the first sin of all. When the snake convinced Eve she could handle it. And she didn't talk about the temptation with Adam. She certainly didn't talk about the temptation with God. And one of the first signs that we're in trouble is when we can't talk about it with somebody else. We keep the snake a secret because at some level we may want to grasp it. David grabbed the snake. And he thinks he can handle it. And he thinks he has handled it on his own until somewhere around a year later, in the next chapter, the text reads, "So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle, and the poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his own cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. And David was furious." It's obvious in the parable who's who, isn't it? And David said, "As surely as the Lord lives, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die." Now, David has been playing God with people's lives right and left. He has been playing God with Bathsheba's life, with Uriah's life, with Joab's life, with his army's life, whoever was out on the front lines with Uriah then. He's been playing God with all these people's lives. And this time, God plays God. He sends this prophet named Nathan. And Nathan is going to be a truth teller. And he is holding David accountable to live up to all those Psalms he wrote. And so here we go. Here's the one thing I hate most about being a Christian. Because I know some of you are sitting there saying, this is the most misnamed title of a sermon I've ever heard. Anita Jones came in the building this morning and said to me, "I can't wait to hear this. I can't wait to hear what this is." I said, "Me too." Here's the one thing I hate most about being a Christian. I know I should be a Nathan, but I don't want to be a Nathan. I don't like confrontation. I don't want confrontation. I don't want to stick my finger in somebody's face and say, "You are the sinner. You are the one." And one of the reasons I don't is the same reason I'm sure Nathan didn't want to. Think for a minute what it must have been like to be in Nathan's shoes. How he must have felt when God sent him this assignment. This, my friends, is not what you might call a casual conversation. This is the most powerful man in the world. There is no guarantee, there's not even a shred of evidence that David is going to be responsible and have the right response to what Nathan says. There are all kinds of reasons Nathan could tell himself not to have this talk. I know them because I've told them to myself. Because I don't want to have these talks either. I don't want to have confrontations like this either. There are all kinds of things Nathan could have said. Well, who am I to confront David? Who am I? I've lusted too. I've sinned in my heart too. Who am I? I'm no better than he is. Maybe he's confessed all this to God privately. It's going to be embarrassing to bring this whole subject up. It's going to make us uncomfortable in the future whenever we see each other again. Probably there's somebody else in David's life that's better to talk to him about it. But the most important thing, I would suspect he said to himself, those all had some merit, maybe. The most important thing, I imagine he said to himself is, this guy just had Uriah killed. Privately. I'm here privately. But instead, Nathan looked straight in the eye of the most powerful man in the world, a man who could have put him to death before he got the sentence out, a man who had just killed months before to keep a secret and had kept that killing a secret. And he says to him, "You are that man. This is your story. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of God, and this is what you've done. This is how you have treated me." And I don't want to do that. I don't like confrontation. I want to be liked. I want all those reasons I just gave because I'm the one that made them up. I don't want to be hated, people to avoid me. If truth-telling is so important, if we all agree that we need it to grow, if it is an act of love and not hate, then why does so little of it go on? The answer is simply fear. It takes enormous courage to really tell the truth to people who may not want to hear it. If we speak the truth to someone, things may get messy. We might be rejected. We might get into a long, difficult discussion. There's a good chance we'll be accused of meddling in what's not our business. It gets frightening. We usually tell the truth once, and it's very costly to us. It lost us a friend. It lost us a reputation. It lost us something of value to us, so we choose rather to live in peace. Telling people what they want to hear is not love. Did you hear me? Telling people what they want to hear is not always love. Telling people what they need to hear sometimes is love. When people are engaged in destructive, soul-threatening behavior, they need somebody who will tell them the truth. And David was loved by Nathan so much that he was willing to put everything he had on the line to tell the truth. Now, we don't know from the text how long it was between David saying, "You are the man," Nathan saying, "You are the man," and David then saying, "I have sinned against the Lord." It might have been instantaneous. We just don't know. My experience in dealing with people was it probably was not instantaneous. I can't hardly ever in my life remember when I've had to confront somebody about something where they immediately said, "I have sinned against the Lord." Almost every single time. They started making rationalizations or excuses or telling me to jump off a bridge or almost every single time. So who knows how long it might have been silent. And the thought surely occurred to David, I handled Bathsheba and I handled Uriah. I can handle this problem as well. Nobody knows but Nathan. If I get rid of him, I'm home free. And then the miracle begins. A heart that has been stone cold because of loving confrontation turns back to the man that is after God's own heart. And he says, I have sinned against the Lord. Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about this? What if David had not had a Nathan in his world? You ever thought about that? How would his life have turned out? Well, we don't know, but he's gone on for the better part of a year without straightening himself out and repenting and confessing his sins. And there's every indication to believe that without Nathan to interrupt him, that would have continued on indefinitely. And by the way, that's not just true for David. Without a Nathan in our lives, we all might do the same thing. You know how I know that? I've done it multiple times. I've rationalized and I've excused and I've explained away to others and to myself. You see, David, a man after God's own heart, did not set out to be a murderer and an adulterer. Most of us don't intend to make a mess of our lives. Nobody walks down this aisle and takes a vow of marriage planning their divorce date at the same time in their mind. No dad welcomes a baby into the world and plans on later up being a polite, distant stranger. No disappointed young mother picks up a glass of wine to take off the edge of her boredom and plans on attending an AA meeting the rest of her life. No business person ever makes his first deal and becomes so consumed with greed that it overwhelms him and that all the generosity and compassion drains out of his soul and is replaced completely by greed and pride. No one plans these things, but they happen every day. Why? Here's at least one major reason. We have no one in our lives to stop us. We have not invited anybody to tell us the truth, regardless. We have our own self-perception of who we are and what we do and what we will do, and we will lock ourselves into it like a cage, and we will not let anybody approach it. But you see, when we have nobody to answer to, no one holding us accountable for living up to the values that we say we hold, we become very vulnerable. Very vulnerable. And that's why we all need someone who will confront us, who will have the courage when necessary to say, you are the man, you are the woman. And this is the thing I hate most about being a Christian. It really is. Because I utterly despise confrontation. So I'll rationalize away why I shouldn't confront, or explain away why I shouldn't confront, or usually just avoid altogether. But I know I need a Nathan. And I know I should be a Nathan. And I know that without a Nathan, David ultimately would have never written those beautiful twin psalms of contrition and confession and penitence. Psalm 32 and Psalm 51, which contains some of the greatest words in all the Bible. Psalm 51, which contains my favorite verse in the Old Testament after Nathan had confronted him, and he said in verse 10, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." In the next verse, he says, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation." I know that without a Nathan, we don't have those words. And so, the thing I hate most about Christianity leads me back to the first words I said. There is a foundational principle that is true about nearly all of us. We want to know the truth, but we very much do not want to know the truth. So we have to fight this part over here in order to get to the part over here that God wants. Us to allow other people to be in our lives enough that they can say, "Hey man, I think you might be on the wrong path," and not get mad at them. And for us to be willing to then say to somebody that we see on the wrong path and willing to risk maybe even losing the relationship, "I love you, and because I love you and because God loves you, I want to ask you about this." We'll never be real as a Christian family till we can do that with one another like we do it with our own family at home or the people who are closest to us, or if you never even do it with them, hopefully like you do it with God. That's why the Bible says, "Confess your faults one to another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The fervent, effectual prayer of a righteous man avails much," James 5:16.